So there's a lot of things that people out there in our world today can get into. A lot of things that people adopt as hobbies, devote themselves to. And it's always surprising for me to see how weird some of these are. You know, how people can devote themselves to some of these things that you just look at it and you go, why would you do this? That's my experience when I think about people who are into artificial languages. Now, so there's certain like artificially created language with their own vocabulary, their own rules for grammar. And like for me, when I went through high school and college and especially seminary, all these things I had foreign language requirements, and I struggled with those. And to think that some people like do this for fun, it's just weird to me. Now, here's a bit of trivia for you. What is the most popular artificial language? Klingon. That is right. Klingon. The language used by the Klingon characters in Star Trek started out in 1979 when the first Star Trek movie came out. The producers needed some Klingon dialogue, and so James Doohan, the guy who played Scotty, he volunteered to take care of this. And so what he did, he wrote about this later, or said it in an interview, that he basically just shouted a few lines of, quote, aggressive gibberish into a tape recorder, and then the actors from the movie memorized those lines for their parts in that movie. Well, 5 years later, they needed more extensive Klingon dialogue. This is for the movie Star Trek 3, and so they hired a guy who was a linguist named Mark Okrand, and he had worked on creating the Vulcan dialect or dialogue in the Star Trek 2. And so Okrand took those gibberish lines from the first movie, using those sounds that they created, and out of that he built a vocabulary and grammar for the Klingon language. And so they used this then and translated it into Klingon for the actors. And he made this language as alien and bizarre as he possibly could. In fact, he used sentence structure that he said, quote, is non-existent in human speech. Okay, that's all just interesting trivia. Here's where it gets weird. And this is why I bring it up today. That language, or this language, has taken off, as we said, and some people are really into it. Okrand published a Klingon dictionary. Thought it would sell a couple of thousand copies, you know, kind of be a novelty item. People could put it on their coffee table, you know. Maybe people could memorize a few Klingon phrases that they could shout at people when they're driving in their car or whatever. Well, it sold 250,000 copies. And most people bought it as a joke. But there's a small group of people who like really got into it, dedicated themselves to learning this language and using this language. So there's a Klingon Language Institute in Pennsylvania, and they publish a journal, which is a magazine that has fiction and poetry in Klingon. There's an even smaller group of people who've devoted themselves to learning and speaking Klingon fluently. And so they get together and practice, and they go out to dinner and have conversations in Klingon. Started out with about a dozen people in the world, and now it's up to about 60 people, the estimates are, who are fluent in Klingon. And in fact, if you want, don't do this right now, but you can go on your phone. If you have Duolingo, the app, the language learning app, actually has a Klingon language that you can learn. Well, there's a guy, this is one example, a guy named Darman Spears, married, had a little kid. They decided to raise this kid to be bilingual, English and Klingon. And Spears himself then only spoke Klingon to this kid as he was raised, and then his wife spoke English. I don't know if there's a particular, psychological diagnosis that this poor kid has now, but it's just weird. I don't know what you think about this. When I first heard about it, I thought, isn't it amazing what people devote themselves to? And then I kind of thought, well, it's actually kind of, I don't know, it struck me as also kind of sad, right? If you think about ambition, think about dedication. It's amazing how trivial some things are that people devote themselves to, that some people build their lives around. Pretty much everybody is ambitious about something. And it's, again, kind of weird to realize what some people are ambitious about, how unimportant some of the things are that people are ambitious about. Now, there are Christians, some Christians who think that ambition is bad. That when you become a Christian, you just surrender your will to God, meaning you surrender your ambition to God, and you just sort of then go through life, take everything as it comes, and just assume everything is God's will, and you let go of everything and let God. And I mean, I recognize there's the part of that that's open to God's direction. That's good, but there's more to it than that. I mean, if you think about it, like the Apostle Paul. He was very ambitious. Well, there's a lot of the characters in the Bible were very ambitious, but including and maybe especially Paul. And we see this in our text today. We can define ambition as just very simply, it's the desire to succeed. It's the desire to succeed at something. And before Paul met Christ, before Paul came to faith in Christ, he was very ambitious about his Jewish faith, and he was very concerned about this new sect that had grown up called Christianity, and his ambition was to stamp out Christianity. And so he devoted himself to this, hunting down Christians, getting them thrown in jail. He was making a name for himself in this quest. And so, we know the story. He comes to faith. Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus. And what happened to Paul's ambition then? He didn't lose ambition. He just changed it. He just transformed his ambition into something else. And in fact, if anything, after meeting Christ, after becoming a Christian, he was even more ambitious then. And these verses we're looking at in chapter 3, verses 10 through 21, Paul talks about how motivated he is. He describes himself like an athlete in a race, like these Olympians we've been watching on TV these last few weeks, just, giving everything to win this prize. So this morning I want to talk about this idea of ambition, and we're going to ask ourselves, what are we ambitious about? What's my ambition? What's your ambition? Again, the issue is not so much whether we have ambition or not, but whether we should give up our ambition, but what kind of ambition? What kind of goals? And ultimately, we're going to see there's a fork in the road. There's a couple of directions we can go. So one author put it this way, John Stott, said, "Certainly, no man can know himself until he has honestly asked himself about his motives. What is the driving force of his life? What ambition dominates and directs him?" Ultimately, there are only two controlling ambitions to which all others may be reduced. One is our own glory, and the other is God's. Now, let's take a look at how Paul describes his ambition, and then see how it compares to another category, which we're going to call more of a self-centered ambition. So this ambition, Paul's ambition, we're going to call it a God-centered ambition. And Paul's God-centered ambition is really about this one goal, which he refers to as knowing Christ. That's what he wants. That's what he's dedicated himself to. Now, this Greek word for know is deeper and broader than maybe we think of in the English language. It's more than just intellectual knowledge. It's more than just knowing about something. It's like deeply knowing, like really knowing a person intimately. I mean, this same word is used to refer to lovemaking in the Greek language. It's like knowing, a complete knowing of something, someone, some concept, being immersed in it. That's what Paul wants. That's the focus of his life. This experiencing this intimate relationship with, this intimate union with God, Christ. Paul later talks about Christ being in us, Christ in us, the hope of glory. Now, this ambition for this to happen gets worked out in three ways, and that's where we kind of get back to the outline now of the message here. So first, it involves experiencing divine power. Paul says it's experiencing the resurrection power of Christ. I want to know Christ, he says, and the power of his resurrection. That's verse 10. And the power of his resurrection, very simply, is just the power of God at work in the world, and this power in my life. Like, I think it's in Romans where Paul says that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to you. That power, to experience that, to live in that in our daily lives. So think of it this way. We often talk about anxiety here, and I think that's okay because so many of us deal with it. So many of us struggle with it. And the Bible talks about it a lot. And so, it's easy for us in our world today to get overwhelmed by the challenges we're facing, by the struggles we're going through, by all these things that are stressing us out. And Jesus comes into our lives in the midst of all this stuff that's got us all worked up. And he says, don't worry about it. Don't be anxious. And Matthew 6, this is an example where Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, therefore I tell you, do not worry. Do not worry about your life. Do not worry about what you're going to eat or drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. And then later he says, but seek first his kingdom, that is God's kingdom, God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Okay, now it's one thing to say, yeah, don't worry. But Jesus can not only tell us to not worry, he can help us to not worry. Because he has the power to do something about the things that we're worried about. When I was a little kid, I have a very profound memory of one night. We were looking forward to going on a family vacation. We didn't do a lot of vacationing, but we did some. And I remember we went. We were getting ready. We were super excited about going on vacation the next day. And, the night before we were going to leave, my dad severely injured his back, moving a big heavy motor from a truck to something else. And because of this injury, we couldn't go. And so that was the year I learned the meaning of this phrase, circumstances beyond our control. If somebody promises you something, you're looking for someone to do something for you, even if they love you, even if they want to do it, they can't always do it because sometimes things happen that they can't control. Sometimes They want to do things for us, give things to us, but because of circumstances beyond their control, it doesn't work. And that's why it's so helpful for us to keep reminding ourselves of the power of God in our lives, because there's nothing outside of God's control. Whatever Jesus promises to do in your life and in my life, it's going to happen, because there's nothing that he is not able to do there. And therefore, when he says you don't have to worry about stuff, you really don't have to worry about stuff, because he's got it. If Christ has the power to come back to life, if Christ had this resurrection power, and we know that Christ was there at the beginning of creation, put this world in place, put the stars in place, arranged things in the universe, then nothing going on, in my life today, in our political situation, in your work problem, in whatever, there's nothing that's going to be outside of his control. All right. So the second thing about this divine ambition, this God-centered ambition, knowing Christ is going to involve, this is where it gets a little bit more challenging now, the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. That's what Paul says. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection, but also then the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And this is the sobering part. The understanding that if we're going to know Christ, if we're going to follow Christ, that's going to involve sacrifice. That's going to involve some degree of suffering. And when Paul says he wants to know Christ and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, it's not like Paul is saying that he wants to suffer. This is not some masochistic thing. It's just that he knows that that's going to be inevitable. And also he knows that in order to experience the power of God in him, and if Christ is going to be in him and he's going to focus on that, then that means there's parts of his life, there's parts of him that are going to have to die. He's going to have to put to death this stuff. And so that suffering and that death is part of coming to life to new things. Not long ago, Billy Graham said that within the New Testament, there's no indication that Christians should expect to be healthy, wealthy, and successful in this present age. Christ never told his disciples that they would get an Academy Award for their performance, but he did tell them to expect to have troubles. And I worry sometimes that preachers like me are guilty of false advertising or making false promises. Like if you come to faith, it's all going to be easy, and you're going to have all nothing but, a smooth road and success and everything, and then inevitably that doesn't happen, and we get confused and disillusioned. Well, look, some people, what I just said is something that only works here in America or in Western countries or countries where Christianity is easy to live out, because there's places in the world where suffering is clearly, obviously part of being a Christian, because you're opening up yourself for persecution, right? And that was the case for the people here, that for them to be a Christian inevitably was going to involve suffering, because they would be persecuted for that faith. Paul experienced that persecution, and the people he's writing to, the church in Philippi, they were experiencing that too. So other people experience suffering, and maybe we do in different ways as we serve God. Challenges come, we have resistance, we have to, let's say, make choices that make life harder for us when it would have been easier to compromise morally or whatever. And there's a bit of a paradox here, I realize, because on the one hand, we say, and this really is true, we say that following Christ really is the good life, that is the road that leads to life and life to the full. That's the abundant life. Yes, that's true. We find fulfillment, we find meaning, we find joy in following Christ. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't mean that there also aren't some hard times. that there also isn't struggle and suffering. But the interesting thing and the key thing to keep in mind is that when we do suffer for our faith, or we do suffer in our faith, we don't suffer alone. That God is with us, that God is helping us, that God is giving us strength, that God is giving us a different perspective. And that's what Paul is talking about, the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. All right, third dimension of a God-focused ambition is knowing Christ. There's a future focus to this. And we see this in the last part of verse 11. And the kind of the theme goes all the way through verse 14. So Paul's hope is not just to share in the sufferings of Christ, but also to share in his destiny, to experience the resurrection power, verse 11. And then right away, he goes into verses 12 and 13 about his desire, but also his humility. If you got those verses in front of you, because you see that his goal is knowing Christ and, experiencing that power of God in his life and the resurrection and stuff. But yet, he says 3 times here, I haven't obtained this yet. I have not obtained all this. Later he says, I haven't yet been made perfect or been made complete. And then later he says, I don't consider myself yet to have taken hold of this. I mean, if anybody tries to give you the impression about how super spiritual they are, how super close they are to God, that's a warning sign that they're either being dishonest with you or dishonest with themselves. Paul, the Apostle Paul, near the end of his life, I mean, if you think about the paragon of holiness and devotion to God, at that point in his life, he's still reminding them and still very clear about the fact that he's got a lot of growing to do. He's got a lot of learning to do. I have not yet obtained all this. And that's kind of what this life is about, continual growth. But he goes on to say, but I press on. That's the thing. Even though he's been at this a long time, he hasn't arrived at it. It's his goal, knowing Christ, living the life that Christ offers. He's single-minded about this. It's the one thing I do, he says. Doesn't mean he neglects other parts of his life, but what it does mean is that all these other parts of his life are subordinated to this one overarching goal, this one overriding goal. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, years ago, wrote this. He said, people are created to praise, reverence, and serve God. The other things on the face of the earth are created for us to help us in attaining the purpose for which we were created. Therefore, we are to make use of them insofar as they help us to attain our purpose, and we should rid ourselves of them insofar as they hinder us from obtaining it. It's not wrong to have ambition about marriage, family, career, success in certain endeavors. That's not wrong. In fact, it's appropriate. It's how we were made. But what we need to do is to ensure that those ambitions are integrated with and ultimately subordinated to this focus on knowing Christ and experiencing Christ's power in our lives and this relationship, this connection. And so that when these other goals conflict with that goal, then we put those other goals on the back burner. Now, as we try to live that, obviously we're going to blow it. Temptations will come. We might get bogged down and discouraged. And that's when we need to keep this future focus in mind, that we're always on a path. We're always on a journey. Maybe some of you today are kind of discouraged about where you are in your spiritual life. Just keep taking the next step. Maybe God brought you here today because he wants you to be reminded that where you are in this path, it's okay. Just take the next step. Paul has not arrived, or was not arrived at this point, and neither is anybody. Look at how Paul puts it in verse 13. And this might be a good verse to memorize, put in your journal, or keep in front of you this week. He says, "But this one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining on toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal." Some things that have happened, or our struggles or our failures, maybe it's time to just put that behind you. Just let it go and just press on towards the goal of knowing Christ. Doesn't let himself get bogged down by past failures, despair over his past sins, bitterness over the wrongs that other people had done to him. Instead, he presses on toward the goal. And again, that goal, knowing Christ. And then he says in verse 17, "Follow my example. Give it everything you've got. Make this your number one ambition, to know Christ." All right, so we're going to move quicker now. Because we're going to talk about what is the alternative to that, right? So that's one way to live your life. But there's another way. There's other goals, and we're going to call this a self-centered ambition, as opposed to a God-centered ambition. And we're going to talk about the three characteristics of the self-absorbed ambition. But before we do that, notice how Paul starts this off. And keep in mind, now Paul is a tough guy. He's seen a lot, experienced a lot. But look what he says in verse 18, how he starts this discussion. He says, "As I have told you before, and I now say again with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ." He had a genuine sense of compassion for people who were spiritually lost. And here's some things that Paul tells us about this group of people. And as we look at this list, then maybe ask the question, do I see some of these characteristics in the people around me? Do I see some of these characteristics in my own life? The first one, the first characteristic of self-absorbed ambition, what happens in people's lives is that they then become controlled by their appetites. Their appetites, someone said, their appetites dictate their lifestyles. Paul phrases it this way. He said, "Their God is their stomach," in verse 19. Now there's an image for you. And for some of us, that's literally true. Like we are, so much of our attention and focus and whatever is revolving around eating and drinking habits. But also this, you can apply this more broadly. He's talking about people who build their lives around the satisfaction of our physical desires, our personal desires, our appetites. And, to be clear, we are physical beings. God created us that way. Jesus himself took on human flesh. He had physical desires. Those are not bad. The body itself is not evil. Physical desires are not wrong. There's nothing wrong with enjoying good food, music, exercise, clothes, sexual pleasure. Within the limits God prescribed, these things are his gifts to us, or these things are. The problem comes when these things become the focus, right? When these things they start to eclipse the other stuff and start to pull us away from God because they become the center of our lives. That's the problem. All right. The second characteristic of these people is they boast when they should blush. I ran across that in some commentator. I couldn't remember who said it, so I just using it as my own. I pretend I made it up. They boast when they should blush. Verse 19, he says that their glory is their shame. Another Bible passage about this would be Romans 1. In verse 32, Paul talks about what happens when people drift away from God. He says that although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve punishment, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Some translations say they give hearty approval to those who practice them. And we see this a lot. Like, their glory is their shame. Like, people just like glorifying this stuff that's really not good. And if you think about it, so much of what's happening in our popular culture, reality TV shows, social media influencers, the Kardashians, Real Housewives, you got Cardi B and Amber Rose going on OnlyFans, you've got these stoner culture, stoner celebrities. It's like these verses are being lived out before our very eyes. This is what happens. This is what culture does. People who boast about things when they should actually blush about them. Okay, finally, the third characteristic is that their minds are locked on the here and now. Their minds are locked on this planet. The end of verse 13 or verse 19, he says, their mind is on earthly things. And then once again, we live in this world. Obviously, we have to focus on making a living and taking care of things and relationships and our physical health and all that's one thing, but it's like when that takes over, that's the problem. Verse 20, he gives a contrast. He says, our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly wait a Savior from there, who by his power will transform our lowly bodies so that they'll be like his glorious body. And our bodies are lowly in the sense that they're wearing out. Our physical strength fails, our mental powers start to slip, our eyesight fades. But our bodies are also lowly in the sense that we constantly have to work to control them, to control our appetites and so on. And the promise is, if we look to Christ, put him at the center of our lives, then when this life is over, or when he comes back, whichever comes first, we'll take these lowly bodies and transform them. And people who cannot get their eyes off of this planet miss out on all of that. So, if you step back and think about it, Paul lays out what really is a pretty stark contrast here. There's two paths. Everybody is on one of these two paths. One leading to life, really, and one leading to unhappiness, dysfunction, and ultimate destruction. One has the goal of like personal, individual fulfillment, the satisfaction of our material desires, and the other has the goal of knowing Christ and building life around that connection. And this is a choice all of us are making. What's your ambition? What are you working for? What are you dedicating your life to? And it's not just a one-time decision. I mean, we make this constantly. We make this repeatedly. Kind of like an airplane pilot. You know, you set a direction going to this certain place, and then I don't know if it's winds and other stuff. Things happen, and I mean, I'm not a pilot, but I understand this is what happens, is that they're constantly making adjustments throughout the flight to make sure that they're on that path. And that's how we do it too. Our life, we're constantly called to make these adjustments to stay on course. And that's how it is with our ambition. And so maybe, as we're talking about this stuff today, you have to kind of acknowledge that you're off course right now. And maybe you have been drifting. And today is the day that you can course correct. So, I don't know if you remember this guy, Bill McCartney. He is known for two things. He kind of had two lives. The first is he was the football coach for the University of Colorado. And he was successful in this. And I'm going to read some stuff about him in a minute, but he kind of got disillusioned by that and kind of the second half of his life, he founded the organization called Promise Keepers. And he writes this. It's not going to be up on the screen. I'm just going to read it. It's a little bit longer. This is what he says about this struggle that he had in his life. He says, when I took the job as a football coach at the University of Colorado in 1982, I made a solemn promise. I told everybody that with me, God was first, family second, and football third. But I didn't keep that promise for long. The thrill and the challenge of resurrecting a football program just took too much of my time and attention, and as my teams kept winning, year after year, I kept losing focus on my priorities. When we won the national championship in 1990, many people said that I had reached the pinnacle of my profession. But for me, there was an emptiness about it. I had everything a man could want, and yet something was missing. I was so busy pursuing my career goals that I was missing out on the Spirit-filled life that God wanted me to have. And all because I had broken my promise to God to put God first and foremost in my life. And that's where the idea of Promise Keepers came from. So Bill McCartney made a mid-course correction. And so he took that drive, he took that ambition that he had and refocused it on knowing God and serving God. So the Apostle Paul says there's two paths. Jesus said there's two paths, right? One leading to life, one leading to destruction. One is dominated by the focus on knowing Christ. The other is dominated by the focus on our own simple gratification, personal pleasures, material desires, etc. And each of us have to ask the question, which one am I on? Which ambition am I devoting myself to? Which ambition is worthy of giving my life to? And Paul says, in effect, I've made my choice. I've changed my ambition. I've now become Christ-focused, Christ-centered. And he invites us, will you join me?